Hey everybody, welcome to a new segment here on Improv Tips where I get to get deeper into some of the bigger and more important issues in improv. My guest today is Joe Thompson, and we are talking about exploitation in improv. Now, Joe is a producer and theater maker from Sheffield, and he is the co founder of Little Chicago Theater. He has done a lot of thinking and writing about this idea, so it's really fun to get in there and ask some questions, get some answers, and have a little give and take about the idea of exploitation in improv theaters, improv communities. I learned a ton. I think you will too. So without any further ado, let's get to it. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. This is a supplementary video to Joe's initial tip about exploitation in improv, a subject of which I'm super interested in. And I thought his initial tip was so provocative and so many really interesting ideas that I felt we just scratched the surface of, that I reached back out to him, and he has generously said that he would answer some questions, have a little back and forth, just so we can get a little bit deeper on some of these more complex issues. Joe, thank you for joining me today.
You're very welcome. I like to be very generous with my time. This is entirely for you, and I get nothing from hearing the sound of my own voice.
That's most of my interactions. It is entirely for me, and no one gets anything out of it. So I want to say I just want to dig right in because I have so many questions. I thought your tip was really interesting. And the idea of exploitation in improv is the way that you came at it was not at all what I expected. When we had sort of like really talked about it earlier, I had sort of expected it to be more kind of focused on the idea of some of the problems that we're having here in America in different improv communities, exploitation and scandals and this sort of thing. But you came at it from a totally different angle. What attracted you? I know that you're doing your dissertation actually on this same subject. So what attracted you to this part of the improv question?
Yeah, so I actually did my dissertation, and a couple of years ago now.
Oh,
I'm now trying to put it into action and trying to let it guide some of my work. A couple of people have kept saying I need to publish it, but the problem is it's got like interviews with people, and there's a whole thing. Especially if I want to get it peer reviewed, you've got to get the whole thing's transcribed. And now it's been long enough that I've lost the recordings. It's just a
oh
bit
yeah.
to do. So allowing it to translate through things like this allows me to do it to kind of explore the ideas and put the ideas out there without having to go through the academic process, which can be a bit complicated. But the initial idea came from I seen because it was early. I actually wrote my dissertation early 2020, and it was around about the time that some of the big stories in America were coming forward, and I was seeing them. I'm on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. I was seeing them through shared posts. I have some friends who kind of uh, straddle both sides of the pond. Kind of mutual friend of ours, David Escobedo, is a big one for that. He was very vocal about some of the just sharing the news about some of these. I believe it was 2020 that some of the big theatres closed. And I kind of looked at it and I was like, what's interesting is so in the UK, I would say that compared to America, the improv scene is very fledgling. It's very young. It's not got the big money behind it, all relative, of course.
Right.
Not to say that there's thousands of millions of pounds being moved around in American improv, but if you were to look at British improv, the community is a lot smaller. But I was already beginning to see or hear through the grapevine stories and just general, for lack of a better term, vibes that seemed to connect these really big stories in America with things going on in the UK. And I just started to think, right, well, these feel like symptoms of a systemic issue. Like that can only be the explanation. Either that or improvisers have a natural streak to exploiting each other, which I refuse to believe. I believe a lot of improvisers are actually very positive people. But there must be some systemic issues that are causing these huge scandals to come out of it. And then I began to connect a few more dots and found that, well, actually, there's a lot of behaviors within improv that all kind of lean towards this. And I'm very aware of the running joke, particularly outside of improv, that improv is, has an almost cult status. partly due to the niche interest, but partly in the structure as well. People talk about this idea that they have a shared language, they literally are leveled. There's that famous episode of BoJack Horseman where they go on the cruise ship and literally it's like a Scientology slash improv crossover, cross comparison.
Sure.
So I was like, there's something here, and we can't just put it down to, oh, it's just a load of people getting over passionate about improv and causing, this miscommunication. I was like, this isn't referring to personal idiosyncrasies. It's referring to something quite deep. And it feels like it's only ever mentioned outside of the scene going in. And then some of the symptoms are criticized within the community, but no one has taken the time, in my knowledge, to really dig into what is causing some of that. And actually, I say that some people have done deeper dives that I'm aware of. There's a fantastic improviser in the UK called Stephen Davison who has done some fantastic work looking at some of the diversity issues and by extension the accessibility issues within improv. I went to a workshop by him a few years ago and it blew my mind. It's like the most I've got out of an improv workshop ever. And that was very much that fed in. And then I also read for my dissertation Amy Seahan's book, who I think has done a lot of the legwork in this as well, and recognizing some of the waves and the cultural changes within the way that things have worked within the scene. And so that was a huge inspiration as well. But it did feel like everyone was tiptoeing around, and as a community, we need to face head on that the improv scene is very niche, but it is still susceptible to the same social machinations that any organization can be social to. And while we live in a capitalist society, money will dictate a lot of things, and it will then dictate culture, and culture will dictate the way that money is made. And so the business model of improv sits at the heart of everything else in so many ways. Like we behave around other improvisers and we go to shows and we put on shows and we make decisions as communities in ways inspired by the material reality of the people involved in it. And we can't avoid that. Like culture is across the board dictated by the material conditions that we're in. Without getting too in the weeds of Karl Marx, like this is a reality of it. And so we need to put a critical eye on that and make sure that we're not allowing the way we structure our businesses and by extension communities go unchallenged, and potentially these unhealthy practices just keep going, getting worse and worse and worse until you get what you had seemed to be at the peak in 2020, where improv in America hit all these scandals all at once, huge explosion, like whole big historical theatres falling apart because of because the pressure cooker had hit a certain point. And so that's where this all came from, was to really look at the financial structures and how they influence the communities.
Right. And so in your tip and also in your paper, you really focus on the training center model, which is sort of as you said, I think probably true, the prevalent model for most improv theaters. I'm a product of that model, and I've started theaters with that model, and I've run theaters with that model. So it's definitely something that I that I have a lot of experience with, for sure. So I was really interested to hear your sort of exploration of that idea and the ways in which that can be exploitative. I just want to sort of go, if I could, just a few questions that I wrote along the way as I was listening again and again to your tip, because there was so much in there. And let me just see what I wrote here. So one thing early on, and this may be different for improv in America and improv in the UK, and you can tell me that. I didn't really sort of consider that possibility as well until I was reading deeper into your paper, which I thought was really fascinating. I'm not quite done, but I thought the part that I read so far was great. And you say that there's really that people start improv to learn a new skill generally, and the reason they stay is because of the community and the friends they make, right? And I wonder but my question is, and I think that's true to a certain extent, there's some people that are there, but is it, or did you consider, or is there possible that there's a third reason that people stay for like professional development, people who want to be actors, who want to be writers. And I see that you get into that in your paper, in fact, where the question of like how valuable is that training towards that end.
Yeah, so I think in a short video I oversimplified that a little bit, and there's also a lot more of the social in Britain than there is in America
Mm,
because the prevalent um, basically the celebrities who started in improv are not really super present in the UK. I can't really think of a huge amount who
mm,
are very vocally like, I got my start in improv in the
right.
UK. Whereas in America, the list is endless. You Will Ferrell, Steve Carell, Amy Poehler, yada yada yada.
Sure.
But I the one thing I would say is so I once saw an improv based meme, which is this idea of like, look at all these people who got famous doing improv, and then someone says, "Oh, are they still doing improv now?" And then it's just the other person getting very angry. And unfortunately, there is a truth to that. Is the money that these celebrities make now is in film, TV, writing, etc. So to a certain extent, I think my point still stands is in those people will go through improv and may even touch back on it and and use a lot of it. But the people who go in and get right to the heart and stay, there is a lot of the social, or equally, there is the monetary of like, oh, I can actually make money sharing this skill as well.
Mhm.
Now, again, though, this is something that really separates Britain from America because Britain, there is the open secret that this is not a way that anyone can make any real money uh, unless you tangentially kind of straddle it with other things. So there's a couple of organizations now, a couple of big improv groups in the UK, Ostentatious, Showstoppers, who are getting performers who are going and succeeding in other things as well. But they aren't necessarily then going and doing a ton of interviews being like, improv is how I got here, that kind of thing. So what we don't have is that top to bottom feeding system where it's like the people who get really successful go on an interview, talk about how great improv is, and then the people at the bottom go, right, well, this is what I need to do to get in there. So
Right.
those kind of like this is important training for my professional career types are fewer. So that definitely influenced the way I approached this, as I hadn't really experienced as many of them. However, I think when you look at a lot of the models, they they aren't necessarily they're still not built around that more that more formalized, we're going to provide you with the training. You look at other acting classes and it is a self-contained class. You go to the class, you come out the other end, you will interact with them in other places and you get the networking opportunities, but you aren't fed into a community in the same way as you
Mm,
would be within an improv community. There is much more of this idea of like, do the classes, and then if you do the classes long enough, maybe you'll be able to get into a show and get stage time, get enough stage time. Maybe you'll get to be in a group that uh, you can one day tour, or you can be one of the prevalent groups within our community that everyone flocks to and asks for more advice.
mhm.
Which you get in improv. And that is the other aspect. And I don't know how, I can't remember how much I touched on this now, but that social capital and subcultural capital, which I know I did mention, is
Yeah.
a big factor as well. There are those I know who money is not really a thing they're looking to do with improv, whether it be because they just generally don't have any interest in it, or they know realistically with the job that they currently have, any career in improv would be a step down because there is a cap on how much money you can make off improv, and it just will
Sure.
never be economically sensible. But they still get a lot from trying to climb that metaphoric, um, invisible ladder that exists within the community because the social and cultural capital it gives them
Mhm.
still opens up a lot of opportunities for them and also gives them this sense of purpose and this thing we're all looking for, which is this place that we can feel popular and smart and I have something that other people want. That is a desirable factor within itself. And that, because of the structure which was originally built off the economic model, does mean that it does still impact that social hierarchy as well. We built it for the money funneling up because to a certain extent that is the way that we just defaulted. We found, if we can make money off people doing these classes, it's better to have this slight pyramid shape to it. Not to say it's a pyramid scheme, but that slight. The
Right.
further up you go, the more money is being made, which is very capitalist. It then also imprinted on the social structures as well, which is there has to be a small group of people who are these guru types, whether they're intentional or unintentional gurus,
Mm-hmm.
and that centered attention has a lot of other benefits as well. So it perpetuates beyond the economic.
I think that's really interesting, and I think that's really true of my experience. I think you really nailed it. That those two things sort of go hand in hand. The economics and the subcultural capital really go hand in hand. My question, though, is especially on this, let's say, the side of the subcultural capital, is that um, is the um, a teacher student relationship or teacher students relationship or coach team relationship, is that inherently exploitative though? Is there a way to, because some people have just, I mean, I think for me it seems that some people have just been in it longer, maybe they have something to share, and I think that's a valid thing. But if we can share it in a non-exploitative way, that's obviously the best. But do you think it's inherently sort of exploitative to have that student teacher relationship, or that sort of, yeah, I guess that's the question. Is that inherently
Yeah.
exploitative?
So it's tricky because this is where we almost get into the more wider philosophical questions, because in
Sure.
the end, teacher student is like a lot of hierarchical relationships. Many of them are normalized and not innately problematic, um, but have other questions that come to it. So to use to kind of slightly tangent, I'll come back, but you look at boss worker relationships, they
Sure.
are not inherently exploitative necessarily. If you taking away some of the more I'm trying to avoid going right into just discussing capitalism and capital and working class
Sure.
and capital class. That's going to get way too complicated. But a manager in a company and workers in a company, not necessarily super exploitative. The manager oversees some of the bigger decisions. The worker oversees the day-to-day enacting of the decisions of the manager. Not necessarily a problem in itself. However, it is a imbalance of power, which is so easily exploited, and there are the really egregious forms of exploitation that everyone recognizes, sexual harassment in the workplace,
Sure.
wage theft, etc. But there's also the less egregious that we all recognize, but is not, because it's not egregious, it's very difficult to push back on, and that's where unions might get involved, whatever. But things like just a boss being socially um, problematic, just being for a lack of a word, a bit of a knob, basically,
Fair
just
enough.
an unpleasant person. And if I'm unpleasant to you, as two people who have no necessarily monetary or social control over each other, you just have the ability to go, I'm just going to hang up this call now because you're being annoying, and then I'm just going to remove the
Hmm.
situation. However, if one of us employed the other, then there's that imbalance. To come back to the original, it's the same with teachers and students. And when it's in a school, there is a lot that they put in place. You've got all these checks, training, teachers need to recognize. Still can go wrong, but then there's other checks and balances, accountability, etc. There is sometimes, but within improv, there's sometimes this idea that, well, they're both two sets of adults, and therefore, if they don't like it, they can walk away. But then we come back to this structure again, which is that's not true, really. Especially if you get to say a level 3 class, people have already made their social groups. They've
Hmm.
maybe invested their career on this if they're looking for a more professional angle. They've found that this is their solace in a busy world, in a busy life. They've come here, maybe they've made some of their lifelong friends here. Some people will meet their, girlfriends, boyfriends, partners, wives, husbands, etc. There,
Sure.
they build their life around these communities, and we live in a society where building communities is quite difficult because we're all quite atomized across all these different places. We mainly communicate through online, so a physical place to go and meet people is a great resource to people. So that imbalance is heightened, and therefore it's not about saying, oh, therefore it's naturally exploitative, but it's naturally unbalanced. And treating it as anything other than that is where it becomes exploitative. And also, to come back to what I said in the video, I also don't want to. We have emotional connotations with exploitative that are not necessarily true to the definition of the word. I looked it
Right.
up the other day, and exploitative literally just means like utilizing an unfair situation for personal gain. So the teacher-student relationship is the unfair situation. It's an I prefer the term unbalanced because fair is a very subjective thing. Balanced is
Right.
a little bit easier to get objectively reasoned. That unbalanced situation can be exploited, and in many ways financially it is often very exploitative because the students are often bringing more than the teachers to the organization. And that sounds like a controversial statement, but I can back it up.
Great.
Students, especially in smaller organizations, they are also acting as the marketers because they go out to their friends and they bring them along. They'll
Hmm.
often do shows for free or for very little money, especially things like graduation shows where it's completely normalized to do that for free. But then all their friends and family come and see it, and they may be donating or paying for things. They are also providing the community experience, and this is something we. This is something that this is where we get really into the weeds of the again the who's bringing what to the table in the community. But I run a drop in on Wednesday, so it's actually when as I'm interviewing, I've got someone covering the drop in for me, and we have people come along to that. If all those people who they come, we only ever charge just to pay the space, but if they all didn't come, we wouldn't have money to pay for the space, so we'd lose the space. That also anyone who knew who came would come to an empty room with just me and the other teacher going, hello, there's three of us here and it's a little bit uncomfortable. They may not meet someone that they can connect with because everyone's different, and you know the more people there, the more likely people are to connect with people. And people bring little tiny bits of social labor every single time they attend a session. So to then just default to this idea of like, but I've been doing improv longer, so therefore I am the person in the room bringing the most value, is massively flattening the whole experience of what improv is. Again, not to diminish the role of the teacher. They have put in hours and time and all that labor I previously mentioned to the communities that they work with. And then on top of that, they are adding this, bringing that experience back to them. So I'm not saying, therefore, that our teachers aren't that important, but it's about contextualizing that importance and going, yes, but this isn't like once you hit that point, you then become the most valuable person in any room that you walk into, as long as there's not a more experienced teacher in that room. Because then you also get into this very weird world of like, on a social level, you start going, okay, so where do I value myself in terms of experience? Because monetarily, how much can I charge from a class? Because Jim over there, he's been doing improv 2 years longer than me, and he charges this amount. So am I worth 2 years less? Let's divide how long he's been doing improv
Right.
by the money he's charging, and maybe that's how much per year. And it again, it's flattening the whole thing. So the very long-winded way of saying that, like, no, it's not naturally exploitative, but you really I think organizations have to drill into a lot of that and not default to this idea that teachers bring the most important things to the room, followed by performers, followed by students, and we value those accordingly. And then when you get to the teacher level, it's how what relationships those teachers have built and also how long they've been doing it. And that's just default, and that's fine because that's also how these exploitative people can end up rising to the top and gaining so much social
Right.
power to exploit and cause all these scandals, because the longer they're there, the more their natural inherent value continues to accumulate within these communities, which makes them harder and harder to hold accountable because suddenly the whole organization hangs on their ability to pull in people.
Right. I think that idea of accountability is really interesting and really important, and definitely sort of more of an active conversation nowadays than, let's say, when I was coming up. We I'd never even thought of that sort of thing. It was just like, oh, here's our teacher, and we're listening to them, and we hopefully get something out of it, and we sort of move on to the next level. We're talking about teachers and students, though. You said something really interesting that I wanted to sort of drill down on for a second. And you sort of give the example of, let's say a student is like in level 2 and they've made a bunch of friends, and then there's an audition, let's say, or something to get into level 3, and they don't make that audition, right? Or they can't
Yeah.
pay for that class. The pay for the class is a separate. Let's sort of make those into two issues for a second. If they don't audition into that class, you say that could put their personal relationships at risk, and that is in some ways exploitative, which I sort of understand, but I also I guess I'm sort of at sixes and sevens in the sense that, like, doesn't the theater also have a responsibility to sort of quality control and make sure that the students are mastering certain skills? If you believe in a training center model, you may not believe in that at all, in which case the whole question is moot. But if you believe in that model, isn't it incumbent upon the school to make sure students are mastering those skills to move up?
So there's a few different aspects that I kind of want to separate in a few different threads.
Yeah,
So the
yeah.
first one is this idea of the whole training center model, and because I also don't want it to feel like my primary purpose is to criticize that model inherently. It has
No.
its values, but you
Yeah.
have to understand the model and you have to utilize it for the mission of the organization. So the organization has to know what it's aiming to achieve. It has to put that out there as its primary purpose, and it has to build everything around that. So you talk about this idea of quality control. Now, if you're an organization that prioritizes this idea of we train the best improvisers, people who come out at the top end of our class are going to be the absolute best. We are the improviser equivalent of like a theatre school, RADA for improv, that kind of thing, which you get organizations in America, people, organizations like Second City, UCB, where their reputation over on this side of the pond, definitely that's the impression I get.
Mhm.
However, then you have to completely separate the social aspect. You have to be like, this is a professional training center. The
Mm.
ability to get into our classes, into our shows, sorry, to get into our house teams, completely separate to doing our classes, because we don't hire people based on whether they've done our classes. We hire people on whether they're good enough. So you should be able to walk in town having done training at a different school, audition, and if you're good enough, then yeah, sure, we'll bring you in. And that's, I've heard a lot of stories to suggest that's not always the case. And again, then that's where you have to challenge a lot of those uh, like aspects of it. And then if you are like, no, we're building a community around improv, then you have to focus on building a community around improv. And then you have to lose a lot of these pearl clutching worries about not being the best at something,
Mhm.
because that's a subjective, and I have a lot of other things to say about what makes a quote unquote better improviser. But B, it is also like not the point of the organization you've set up. So there's that. And it's about having clear mission and clear objectives for the organization and being transparent with that. But then you have to come to this idea of like, what are the benefits for gatekeeping the ability to access more information? The level 3 classes have this idea of like, to even be able to kind of cross the threshold into this level of knowledge gaining, you have to be a certain level of good. Now, uh, to take that and kind of badly transpose it to another situation, if I was in, what we would call in the UK year 9, and I'd finished year 9 maths, and I was getting to a point where going to year 10 maths, but they were like, oh well, actually you're not doing very well, so you just don't get to go into year 10. Not you have to repeat year 9 or whatever. You just don't, like, that's it. What you do now is up to you. It's like, well, no, that person needs extra support. They possibly need extra tutoring. They need, but this idea of like, you've come up so far, You go to the next level, you don't pass, and then it's just like, okay, cool, see you later, see you next year when we audition again. It's like, okay, so you're you're the, you're then supporting in a very hands-off way, which then raises the question of like, okay, so these very successful people who are coming out the top of your organization, are they successful because of the knowledge you gave them, or are they successful because you carefully vetted everyone at the right stage? So the people who are probably already naturally disposed to become good enough got to the end, and everyone else got turned away at the point that it was clear they weren't going to get any further. Because then that questions the ability of your school to teach as opposed to just spot talented people. So, and there are other ways of doing this. There are ways of doing this without massively separating people into these ability groups in a way that means that they get less opportunity to interact with people of different skill levels. You see it in martial arts. Martial arts classes will often be mixed ability, but then if you want to go to that next level of qualification, which would be belts often in martial arts, um, then in that instance, you just go forward, you put yourself forward, you get it or you don't, and then you carry on. But everyone's still learning together. And I think in improv, the shared learning experience where brand new people and people who've done it for years is super important because there's a lot you can learn from people who know less than you because maybe they've been to that one workshop that you never went to and it's like, oh, actually, I've learned about this thing. And you have that conversation and you gain a bit of information because even though they've done it less years than you, they coincidentally went to this really great workshop. Or they do something really interesting in the rest of their life and they bring their life experience to the improv room and it enriches your practice that way. Creativity is not a linear thing. You learn through the shared experiences and the cultural absorption you get from everyone in that room. So passing people out into level classes, I never think makes any sense anyway. Taking people like, right, you're at a level 3 level, we've auditioned you and confirmed that, you're going to get to go in this room and all work together, and everyone else needs to go away and they can come back and see if they're good enough again next year. Well, those people have lost out on the opportunity to be around people of different skill levels and potentially glean other areas of enrichment to their practice from those people. So even if you take aside this idea of what is the purpose of an improv organization and is it purely to just create the best improvisers to then go on and do film and TV where maybe they don't do as much improv, which is another aspect of that. Even if we take that as a default, there are other ways of approaching that removes this kind of like work your way up the ladder bit by bit.
And what are just sort of, I mean, what are those other ways? Like, I guess I'm sort of like laboring under my own experience. So like, I'm really curious, so, like, what are the other ways? I know there's another model where rather than like level 1, level 2, level 3, people are doing more of a flat structure where it's like, oh, this class is all about environment, and this class is all about emotion, and this class is about scene work, and this class is about editing or whatever. But what do you think? What are those alternatives to that level structure?
So again, I think the key thing I would say is again it all comes back to purpose. Some organisations I would almost say will maybe look beyond the teaching of improv as a core form of income. Amy Seahan's book looks at the fact that actually Second City originally set out to be a theatre that made its money from its box office, and it had to then divert away from that for various reasons. But there was a point where that was something that could be achieved, and what was lost there could be returned to that, etc. In the UK, there's funding for things like this, so maybe certainly, I'm very much advocating for in the UK more improv companies to look for things like Arts Council funding, or like you get these trusts and foundations that will fund things that are for like social good, and so look at doing things like a show that the Arts Council will fund, or teaching improv in a way that engages communities and you will be able to find funding from that somewhere if you know where to look. But to take that aside, because that is almost saying do something completely different, and a lot of organizations quite rightfully would be like, well, we're here now, so where do we go from here? I do still think there's a few other alternative ways to tweak the level structure to make it a little more equitable and a little bit more community friendly, I think would be the term I'd use. So the first is the martial art structure that I previously mentioned. This idea of everyone learns together, but then you set tiers or some kind of belt or badge system that people can kind of go, I'd like to be able to put myself forward for that. And then people are still coming away with this qualification that will still help them in the professional world if that's what they're going for, and be able to say, oh, I've hit level 4 in this school who have a really big reputation. And they say I'm level 4 good at improv. Now, you need to make sure that you build all the infrastructure around that. It has to be quite clear what the skills are that you need to demonstrate at each level. You need to be able to prove that they are kind of central to improv and not just a certain style of improv. Or if you do a certain style of improv, that you are saying to people they are level 4 at this style of improv. It needs work, but so does every system needs work.
Sure.
But that's one way.
I would definitely love to see someone come away saying, "Oh, I'm a black belt in improv."
Yeah, but this is I'm pushing for that as a thing at some point. Definitely going for like black belt improv, and then going and saying that someone with my wife is actually a black belt in taekwondo, so I definitely don't want to then be like, and I'm a black belt in improv, because she will kick me, and then we'll see who the real black belt is. But yeah, so there's that way. You mentioned about this idea of doing it more subject based. I wanted a conversation, and I can't remember who it was now, but we played with this idea of like that, but almost treating them like scout badges. So you do a class, and then you can come away with some kind of booklet or something that has a thing that says, "Oh, I worked with this school on this thing," because the way with all of these methods, I'm always still thinking of the idea of the reason a lot of people like the level system is they can come away, and whether it be socially, or they can still say, look, this is what I've achieved. The achievement is important for some people, but you can still extract the achievement from the hierarchy. And there will be still people who'll be like, well, I got 6 badges for these things and you only got 5, so therefore I'm going to treat you as scum. And but I'm never going to try and claim that we're going to be able to hit this utopian world where everyone treats improv like it as equals and all that, because people are people, and everyone's gonna, you will find, um, you know, toxic people who will try and play up people against each other, whatever. But you can reduce it, and you can separate achievement from social status a lot more. So the badge system is another one. The other, and this is very dependent on the organization, is you just go, we don't care. We don't care about the achievement. We ask you to help fund the organization so we can keep it going, but we're not here about this exchange of like, well, we're important, we have knowledge, so we're going to give you that knowledge and you're going to pay us for it, because us being incredibly knowledgeable is worth money and all of that, and an incredibly capitalistic way. And instead you go, look, we've done this for a while. We've built this organization around trying to do more of it. We ask for money in whatever way we ask for money for, whether it be you still pay for classes or whatever, but we're super transparent about the fact that it's this idea of like, that's to allow this to continue to exist. And it is nothing to do with like, we're more important than you are. It is everything to do with the fact that like, there need to be people who are overseeing the admin of things, who are making sure that the building that we have is still there, and that people still know we're here, and that the marketing's done, etc. And also someone to take responsibility for the classroom and make sure everyone in that classroom is safe and happy and well.
Right.
And this is more of like a spiritual change than it is an actual structural change, but it will then by default have structural impacts to it. You will lose all level terminology with classes. You will start making everything as its own thing. You build in a slightly different way. Drop-ins and community events become a lot more important. And again, That is not going to work for an organization who sells itself on training up the next level of comedic actors. But it might work for an organization in the middle of a very atomized community in the, say, the very center of America, far away from all the cities where
Right.
people are going off and becoming famous, or in the UK, if you're outside of London, where people aren't necessarily going to that to become the next big comedic performer, then
Right.
we don't necessarily need to adopt any of this leveling structure. And we can go completely the other way and say, look, we're just a community. And the only reason some people are getting paid for this while other people are paying in is because those are the people who are spending every single day doing all of the fundraising admin and all this stuff that needs doing to keep the lights on. And if you really want to lean extreme on that, maybe that no one gets paid for it, but everyone volunteers a little bit of time, a little bit of money just to keep things going. And
Hmm.
at that point, you're looking at voluntary organizations, and they do exist on their own level and they have their own challenges because it's a lot harder to keep people focused on a voluntary thing because the moment their job or their family life take up more of their time, they are going to drop it a lot quicker.
Right.
And that's not necessarily a personal thing. It's just that people have to, especially nowadays with a lot of the problems in the world, people have to prioritize their own financial sustainability.
Sure.
But it is one direction that you can go. So there's, and from each of those things I mentioned, there's lots of branches off that and branches off that again. And I just think we've almost become a little bit complacent in the model that currently exists because people have all come from who are everyone in the current improv community have come from that model.
Yeah.
And it there's people don't really question the things that they just took as normality. We do it in a lot of society. We do it with the schools we grew up in. People don't. People might go, "Oh, I didn't learn the important things in school," but no one's. Not many people are out there going like, "Oh, I really think we should change the school system," unless they're teachers or working in education, in which case maybe. But a majority of people in improv are exactly the same, unless they're making a lot of time to go. How do we build an organization around this? Many people just go, "Oh, I'll do it. I got loads out of the model I came from, so I'll just do that again,"
Yeah.
which has an element of survivor bias. Because what about the people who went to one of those classes that you went to, went not for me, and then never came back? Another piece to final point on this, there is one tangible thing that I would like to see a lot less of because I think the social side. This reinforces the social side of this a lot, and no one ever notices warm ups that put people radically out of their comfort zone, doing something that feels very, we're all the really culty feeling warm ups, your zip zap boings, your mind melds, your things that feel like a ritual at the start of a sacrifice. This is what I feel. I've done improv for years, and I do warm ups that I go, oh my god, if someone walked in here, they would think there was a goat in the other room, and we were going to be slitting its neck and throwing its blood everywhere because this is really weird and culty, and people I get the reason behind it is you need to be able to get outside of your comfort zone to do good improv. But you have to recognize that for some people that's going to be really hard. And to reinforce this idea of like we're all doing it and we're all clearly having fun and we all get this, and the fact that you're uncomfortable is a problem with you. And this is making you lower on the rung of understanding improv. And that will be the first thing that people will go, oh, this is not for me. This is not my cup of tea. This is a group that I am on the outside of. So uh, trying to find warm ups that put people on an even keel is just a really simple thing I think we could do that will remove this kind of like you're going to come into the room and the first thing you're going to experience is something that helps you realize that you're not as knowledgeable on this as everyone else because everyone else has immediately started doing this ritualistic thing that you don't understand. If we can eliminate that and work more on equalizing warm ups, I think we'll be onto a winner.
That's really interesting. That's a tough one for me to swallow because I love a good ritualized warm up for sure. But
Yeah,
that's really interesting, and I'm glad you said that because that was one of my. I only have like a couple more questions, but that was definitely one of them. You talked about that, and then also the jargon. But doesn't pretty much every pursuit have its own sort of jargon?
absolutely. And again, the Jargon one is one that I threw out there, and I'm glad that I've had this opportunity to clarify because there's there's technical language, there's jargon, and then there's what I would call aggressive jargon, which is jargon put into a situation where maybe it doesn't need to be.
Mm-hmm.
So the technical language, so things like game of the scene, stuff like that, really useful terms to help people share and get their heads around some of the things. And then technical terms that are not really technical terms but are used in a very specific way, like listening skills. Everyone understands the basics of listening skills, but it's used in a very specific way in improv. I don't have an issue with a lot of them. I don't really have an issue with jargon either. It's just I think you could throw out something like that and someone would go, "What?" And you go, "Oh, sorry, yes, let me clarify." Jargon is when you get really into the weeds of like, oh, well, we're going to do, it's like a little, what we're going to do now is a little bit like a montage, but it's got aspects of an Armando, but there's definitely a Harold structure in there somewhere. And then we're going to do a group scene and there'll be a monologue, but the monologue is actually going to be backwards, like where you are just throwing words without any consideration of who in that room might know it. And again, if you are in a room of your performing troupe and or a group of other teachers and you're there specifically because you're doing some kind of teacher discussion, go ham, throw out the most jargoniest jargon, uh, whatever. But even if you're in a room where you're like, oh, well, we're all improv community, not everyone is going to have done maybe that specific type of long form. So maybe don't throw it out like it's nothing. And again, I'm not saying that people who do that are bad or wrong or anyway, but we don't think about enough that like we all come from improv from wildly different places. And we then just use language as if it's this unifying, completely normalized thing. And yet, one example of this, one demonstration of this, I found very early on when I was doing a lot more short form improv, was when you would go, "Let's do this game," and I go, "What?" Like I'm in a conversation with you. We're both deciding on a game to do. We go, you say, "Let's do this game." I go, "I've never heard of that game in my life." You begin explaining it, and I go, "Oh, you mean uh, Big Nana's Knickers? Oh, we call it that." And there's just this whole rigmarole of like, "Oh, let's find this common language." And it's completely normal and it happens all the time, but it should be a demonstration that never assume common knowledge when it comes to specific language that we use for those very specific terms. And there's an assumed knowledge so much, and it causes all these stumbling blocks. And for a lot of people, they begin to go, oh, is this because I'm not in on the next level of inner circle of improvisers who know this? Or, oh, we call it this because we went and learned it from this person, and this is really. So it it's again to take what in a very short thing is like do this, do this, do this. It's very nuanced, and it's about this idea of like just read the room, look at the space you're in, and maybe don't stand at the head of the room going, "Oh yes, well I went to see this show and it had some fantastic Harold aspects, but they played this game called New Choice, and then they did a little bit of Revolver in it," and just potentially lose not only the people who are there for the first time, but even people who've done it for 4 or 5 years, but have no idea what you're talking about. And then aggressive jargon is when you're like, no, no, this person is weaponizing their jargon to try and pass out themselves from the rest of the room by showing that they know stuff. It's the equivalent of being a name dropper for someone who works in the arts, being able to say, "Oh yes, well when I worked with Brecht on this workshop in 19 diggity 4 or whatever." There is no reason to continuously return to that other than to establish status. I'm not saying never mention cool things that you've done or things you enjoy, but be aware of why you're doing it. And when you're aggressively jargoning, I find it very difficult to think that those people don't in some way know that there is a social status aspect to that. And they're trying to gain a bit of social capital by
Right.
going, "Look at all this that I know. I clearly must know what I'm talking about." But people like that, again, I'm probably never going to get through to them by just saying this in this interview now. But I can definitely say is watch out for other people who do that and try and dilute it a little bit. Maybe if you're someone who hears someone else aggressively jargonize loads of terms, and you know you hold a little bit of social capital in that situation, maybe what if you went, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've never heard that term before," and you start playing the fool to try and A, make other people feel less bad for maybe not having heard the terms, and B, make it less of a thing that knowing words is important or knowing what certain terms
Right.
mean is important, and just kind of make light of it and be like, oh my God, I've been doing this for years and I've never heard of a Harold or whatever. Obviously play
Right.
it by ear, but like a lot of this can be done socially as well.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. It's just the I think it's sort of that idea of like being aware, like reading the room, I think is really the headline of that, of like knowing who you're talking to and not trying to yeah, also the idea of like accruing status to yourself by aggressively jargonizing or whatever, I think is really interesting. I just have two last questions. One is we're sort of talking a little few moments ago about classes, and maybe we do like a mixed level class sort of operation. But even in your paper, I think you mentioned, or you sort of talk about the reservation where people are like, well, I want to work with people who kind of done it as long as I've done it, because and I think this is, I don't think I'm speaking out of school here, but when you've done it for a while, you make different kinds of mistakes, say, than someone who's brand new at it, and you're trying to sort of work on, I don't know, editing or character, and that other person maybe is brand new and they're still working on yes and or something. Do you know what I'm saying? Isn't that idea of wanting to work at a higher level or sort of a more experienced level, isn't that a valid thing? Or is that assumption even exploitative in its own way?
Yeah. I think it is in some ways sort of. No, it's not exploitative as a concept, but sometimes in the delivery of it, it can be. And again, the exploitative aspect is specifically in the way all of these ideas generate this hierarchy, and that hierarchy can generate income and social capital for certain people. I want to be
Mm-hmm.
really specific with the use of that term because I don't just want to be like, thing I don't like about improv, point at it, that's
Right,
exploitative.
right.
Like, and that's I think it's a very powerful word, which is why I keep returning to it, but I do want to be specific. But I think there's a lot of that idea of like, well, we want to cultivate spaces with other people of a similar level because then we can all have this shared, we're all kind of at the same level of challenge and we're all trying to work out these things at the same time. It flattens a lot of nuance. And it takes a lot of onus off the person facilitating that space to cultivate a space that will allow people of different skill levels to still learn. So what I mean by that is, so say for example, yes, you're an experienced improviser and you're looking at specifically how to edit someone really well. Let's just take that as a really specific example. You're
Okay.
someone who, like, I've done this for years. My yes anding and all of that, I've got down, but I find that I'm just struggling to edit in the right way. Actually, I'm going to use a personal example to make this even easier. I
Okay.
have an issue when I'm working on stage. I lean on chairs all the time. I have this real bad habit of gravitating towards chairs, and all my scenes, I'm leaning on the backs of chairs. And I was trying to challenge on that. I actually got over that in a mixed skill space because, to a certain extent, the concept of that was something that I kind of passed out as as a personal thing, but also like stagecraft with new people, you get to see other people approach that subject with brand new, fresh eyes. And if you have the right mindset of going, okay, well, let's look at how they approach this, what are the challenges they're facing, and you still take the right reflective approach to that, you are still going to get a lot from that, even if you're not learning from a more skilled or equally skilled person. So I watched someone who was trying a scene with a chair for the first time ever, and they immediately like flipped it on its back and turned it into like a turtle shell. And they hadn't done that much improv before, and they got really. I love when people who've just started improv, they suddenly have this moment where they kind of get it, they get really excited, and they make a massively bold choice because they're like this, and everyone in the room goes yes, and it's a great moment. And you learn a lot from those moments because it's essentially connecting with the excitement around improv, which us veterans, this year actually will be September this year is my 10-year anniversary of doing improv. So I'm officially putting veteran on my on my title of improv veteran. But having done it for 10 years, seeing that first connection, there's so much that can be learned from that. However, there are still scenarios where you're like, oh yeah, but we're working on this technical skill and we really want to kind of
Right.
nail down on that technical skill. That's fine, but that's the responsibility of the people in that room and specifically the people facilitating that space to build around that and make something work. Now, sometimes people can disrupt that, and in part it's because maybe they haven't got some of the basic skills to get their head around that. However, in my experience, those people are often not deterred by the superficial. Those people assume they have a higher level of experience than they do. So maybe you can pass them out in auditions, but auditions are also a very imperfect science anyway, because someone could do really well in an audition, and then you get them into that space, and actually they have blagged their way through that audition. They don't know what they're talking about. But a good facilitator should be able to build around their unique approach to things or their pitfalls and still help them and everyone else get something out of that. Facilitate discussions in the right directions. Now, if someone is being egregiously difficult, that's a whole different issue and has nothing to do with skill. That is like, I need to take you out of this space because you are clearly not building towards a shared positive experience.
Right. And then my final question, and this is sort of always I think such a really interesting idea that you sort of mentioned earlier that I want to circle back to for just a moment, is the idea of we have a school, let's say, or a training center, and then but we sort of open our auditions to everyone in the community. I think that's always such an interesting idea of I guess that's really sort of the whole point, really, in some ways, of what you're saying, right? Is that if your theater is saying we were going to put up the best shows, then those best shows should just be based on auditions or whatever sort of metric you're using, and ideally, I mean, it would sort of shake out that your school would be training the people to be the best at the kind of shows that you want to put up. And let's say you're a long form improv theater, then you are hopefully training those people to do that kind of superlative long form improv, and they would naturally succeed at those auditions versus someone who maybe comes from a different kind of improv background and maybe isn't showcasing kind of what the theater is about or something. Am I sort of on the right track at all?
Yeah, so actually, when I did my dissertation on this, I went and talked to, or virtually, because it was 2020, so we were all separate, but I talked to someone who was involved in the Bristol Improv Theatre. Fantastic theatre, love some of the stuff they do, but they had a very interesting approach where they physically separated their school from their theatre as two different organizations. They were two different legal entities as organizations. And very much, if you look at the marketing and everything, I think you could make the argument that they also sell themselves as two different organizations. The theatre looks at creating a nice, varied program of work. Some of it, you know, really pushes the boundaries of what we classify as improv. They have things like Dungeons and Dragons live play shows and like quizzes and game nights that have a lot of performative elements to them as well, like really interesting stuff there. And then the school is meanwhile teaching really interesting, and they do still have like, or certainly when I interviewed them, they still had like level classes and all of that kind of stuff, but they'd separated the two of them. And from the conversations I had with them, it didn't seem like there was too much of a direct connection between being involved in the classes and getting the opportunities to audition for shows. They put, if they ever had a show that they were looking at doing auditions for, they put out public audition things, audition, what's the word?
Like notices,
call out. Yeah, that anyone could submit for, you know, as long as they were in the area and it was convenient for them to do so, etc. And I think that has a lot of benefits. I mean, if you are physically separating the organizational reputation of your theatre and your school, you then don't have to start tying in everything together in a very messy way, because you know, you don't have to be promoting your classes at every single show that you do and make every single show feel like just like a taster session for the classes to come to or whatever, because the school's got its own set of its own team working on things of its own, and maybe they're all supporting each other on a financial level to balance the books or whatever, but like they still exist as two distinct entities, and people can engage with one and not feel like it's a natural pull towards the other. You know, I'm coming to the classes, but I've got this natural pull that I should probably come to as many of the shows as possible and eventually try and get cast in a show or whatever. No, I can just come to the classes and look about and have fun. And probably they will still want to come and see the shows, but it's not an obligation. And equally, people can come to the shows and it feel like its own distinct presence as a show, and not like, and now they're talking about, if I want to do this, I better come along to the workshops and, you know, whatever. So that separation of them, I think it is worth pointing out that it's possible. And therefore, if you are putting them together, you have to make it clear as to why. And then you have to be careful about how you're monetizing those shows, because they're benefiting you twice. Once as a show that's making money, and a second time as an advertisement for your classes. So then really think about how you're paying your performers for that, and really think about the value that they're bringing to that. And really think about, right, well, at that point, if they're bringing in their own money for the shows, why are they then going back and then paying for the next level of classes if they're still going back for paying classes? Because by that point, that's them paying 3 times, once in the show as a performer making you money for tickets, once in the show as a performer making you new students by being the front-facing side, and once as someone then coming back the next day and paying for level 6 or whatever level they're on. So again, I'm not saying that can't, you know, that you can't directly combine them, but you really have to think carefully about what that means for how you are working as an organization.
Yeah, for sure. The idea of like paying the performers is definitely a bigger issue on the rise here in America, for sure. And I think that people are trying to figure out what is that economic model, because there are so many sort of, you know, costs of running a theater, of insurance and, you know, electricity and all those things. And how do we sort of equitably sort of divide up those funds of like classes and tickets and a bar or whatever, in a way that, like you said, isn't sort of like double or triple dipping on the students. Well, we're just about out of time. I just want to say thank you so much for being so generous with your time, doing this deep dive, and just taking all the questions head on. I really appreciate it. So it's given me tons and tons to think about, and people who are starting theaters, or people who are running theaters, or people who, you know, are parts of theaters, a ton to think about in terms of like, how can we do this better? You know, I think sort of one of the great sort of benefits of the seismic sort of destruction of improv and restructuring of improv is that now we get a chance to like look and say, okay, well, the river's not running for a second. What are we going to do? How do we want to restart this? And how can we do it better? And I think that what you're saying it has given me at least a lot to think about in those ideas and in those issues. Thank you for sharing your time.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I have raised a lot of this is raising more questions than providing answers, and I am not apologetic for that, because I think that is where we need to be at right now. And it's been really lovely to be able to talk to someone else about it and raise some more of these questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.